Lowe's Angels carried its night like a second pulse, heavy and slow, as if the entire coastline exhaled through the haze that clung to windows and street lamps. The marine layer rolled inland, flattening color and softening neon until every alley looked like a half-remembered dream. South Arcadia existed on the edge of the city's attention, a district built for those who could survive without being noticed. The air was thicker there, the shadows older, the unspoken rules carved into the pavement long before anyone living could name them. Marina Holt walked home with the familiar weight of exhaustion sinking into her muscles. Her shift in the hospital's 24-hour laboratory had drained her in its usual, methodical way. Rows of vials, coded samples, clinical lighting, the hum of refrigerated units. It was a predictable world of routines and sterile surfaces, and she relied on this order the way other people relied on faith. She had carved her life into manageable compartments, each one sealed tightly enough that grief could not seep through the edges. The city had taken enough from her. She refused to let it take control of her inner landscape. The streets around her smelled of wet asphalt and faint motor oil. Somewhere in the distance, a siren rose and fell, absorbed by the dense night. She preferred walking after her shifts, letting the rhythm of her steps settle her thoughts. Everything felt suspended in a half-sleep, as if the world waited for something to break the stillness. Her phone vibrated once in the pocket of her jacket. The sudden tremor shot through her nerves with more force than she expected. Unknown number. Wrong hour. A small, instinctive fear stirred under her ribs, the kind she usually dismissed. This time it stayed. She answered. The voice that reached her sounded controlled, measured, almost too calm for the hour. It carried the weight of someone accustomed to being obeyed. The resonance in it suggested distance, yet each word landed with the precision of a blade. He spoke her name without hesitation, as if he had rehearsed it, as if it belonged to him in some way she did not understand. Marina felt the cold slide of awareness run down her spine. Someone who should not know her did. He spoke with the steady tone of a man outlining a fact rather than issuing a warning. She needed to leave the street. She must not return home. She had to keep the line open. The instructions came with the inevitability of a closing door. He offered no justification, and his refusal to explain filled the space around her with an unfamiliar tension. Marina disliked being pushed by fear, yet irritation offered no foothold against the quiet force of his voice. She cut the call. The silence that followed stretched thin across her nerves. She almost laughed at herself for reacting, but the tremor in her hands betrayed her. Something in the caller's certainty had stripped away her usual defenses. She quickened her pace, as if pulled by instinct rather than logic. Her street lay ahead, darker than usual, the glow from the convenience store at the corner barely reaching the row of aging apartment buildings. A black SUV stood parked near her building, its windows tinted, its body absorbing what little light the street offered. No headlights, no movement, only the low murmur of a running engine. As she approached, the rear door opened in a slow, controlled arc. Inside, dim light from a phone screen illuminated the interior. The number on the display matched the one that had just called her. The recognition struck her harder than the night air. Then the explosion came. It wasn't the fiery detonation shown in films, but a violent collapse of space and pressure. A flash burst from the building next to hers, bright enough to carve the alley into stark, unnatural shapes. The shockwave hit a moment later, a blunt force that rattled the windows and sent dust drifting from the rooftops. Instinct forced Marina to shield her face. Her own apartment, only a few feet away, shuddered under the impact. For a brief heartbeat, she saw the open doorway of her building outlined in white glare. If she had gone home on time, she would have been inside. The night fell quiet again, but the silence carried a new density, as if the world held its breath. Marina stood frozen, the cold air burning her lungs. In the space of a few seconds, everything familiar had shifted. The man on the phone had not only known her name, he had known what would happen. He had known where the danger would land, and he had placed himself, deliberately, between her and whatever force had struck her street. The open SUV door waited like a threshold. The darkness inside no longer felt empty but watchful, expectant, shaped with purpose. Marina understood, with a clarity that pressed against her ribs, that she had crossed a line without choosing to. Her life no longer belonged entirely to her routines, her lab, her carefully controlled world. Someone else had drawn her into a conflict she could not yet see. If she wanted to survive until morning, she would have to step into the unknown and accept the reality she had tried so hard to avoid. The city around her breathed in the dark, and she felt its cold breath settle under her skin. The car moved along the freeway like something detached from the rest of the traffic, absorbing every pothole and uneven seam with a quiet, expensive ease. The world outside slid past in smears of sodium light and shadow. Overhead, the city's arteries crossed and overlapped, bridges and ramps layered in concrete, their undersides stained by decades of exhaust and rain. The night clung to the windows, broken only by occasional flares of neon and the pale glow of gas stations standing like lonely islands along the road. Marina sat in the back seat, her body angled slightly towards the door, as if that small shift could translate into an escape at any given moment. The air in the car felt colder than outside, filtered and conditioned, carrying a faint trace of leather and something sharper, metallic, that reminded her of hospital instruments. To her right in the front, the driver kept his gaze fixed on the road. His suit fit too well for a hired chauffeur, his posture too controlled, his eyes too alert each time they caught a movement in the side mirrors. He had the air of someone who already anticipated the next problem before it surfaced. Across from her, partially cloaked in the dimness of the rear interior, sat the man who had called her name into the dark an hour earlier. The freeway lights sliced across his face in intermittent bands. Each passing lamppost revealed another fragment, the clean line of his jaw, the stillness around his mouth, the focus in his eyes. There was no wasted motion in him, no fidget, no restless adjustment of his stance. He occupied space like someone accustomed to control, not through overt displays of aggression, but through the quiet certainty that his will would be carried out, one way or another. He had introduced himself with a simple efficiency that carried the weight of a reputation, Reynard Archer. The name settled in her mind like a stone dropped into deep water. It produced ripples, fragments of overheard conversations and half-forgotten articles. It belonged to the invisible architecture of the city rather than to any single building or company. In South Arcadia and beyond, people rarely said the name openly. They hinted at it. They referred to his holdings, his clubs, his shell corporations, the legal front that shielded a labyrinth of unofficial interests. His world intersected with many others: high-end nightlife, discreet private security firms, consulting agencies that specialized in making inconvenient problems dissolve. Money moved around him in patterns that never quite resolved into a clear picture. No one outside his inner circle seemed to know the full map, but everyone who paid attention knew one simple fact: nothing large happened in certain parts of Lowe's Angels without brushing against his shadow. Marina had never expected that shadow to reach for her. As the car cut through the city, he spoke in that same composed tone she had heard over the phone, avoiding unnecessary flourishes. His manner of explaining brought no comfort. It simply imposed structure on chaos. Information that should never have passed through her hands had found its way into the hospital's digital archives. It had not arrived there as an obvious anomaly. It had been buried, distributed, hidden among legitimate records like a contaminant threaded through healthy tissue. A technician from the hospital's IT department had gone missing shortly afterward. Officially, The man's death appeared on paper as an overdose. The files suggested regrettable personal issues, a tragic end. Archer's version of the story left no room for such convenient interpretation. He described it as a removal, a targeted action meant to ensure that the man could not speak, cannot be traced back to what he had done with those files. Somewhere between the technician's clandestine copying and his death, a trail had been laid. It wound through layers of encrypted notes, fragments of logs, and buried metadata. Traced carefully, that trail led not to a known collaborator or co-conspirator, but to her. Not to her department in general, not to a group account, to Marina Holt. The logic behind that connection remained obscured, but Archer seemed certain it was not random. The dead technician had known her name. He had written it as part of his contingency, perhaps as a signpost, a last attempt to throw a line towards someone he believed might become a necessary witness. Or leverage, or bargaining chip. The distinction did not matter much now. Archer's assessment of the situation followed a cold, clinical path. If the technician had time to distribute sensitive information before he was silenced, then others would be hunting for it now. If her name was in that chain, then she had already become an object of interest. The explosion on her street, the almost casual destruction of an adjacent apartment, he framed as a miscalculation. The attack had been designed to remove a potential witness quietly, with minimum questions from law enforcement. Something had gone wrong. Either the timing, the exact address, or the assumption of where she would be at that hour. The message remained clear. Someone had reached into her life without hesitation, ready to erase her as a loose end. In that narrow space of awareness, Archer had stepped in. He did not present himself as a savior. There was no pretense of altruism in his explanation. Protection, he made clear, would serve both of them. He needed to understand what the technician had done, why her name had been used, and how far the contamination had spread through systems that, ordinarily, he would have preferred to keep under quiet observation rather than direct control. Someone somewhere had broken the unspoken balance that kept certain groups from encroaching too aggressively on each other's territories. Information was crossing boundaries it was not meant to cross. That made the city unstable. Archer's world depended on predictability, on knowing where every pressure point lay. This breach had introduced variables he did not accept. Marina listened, watching the shadowed outline of his features shift with passing light. Every instinct in her fought the fact of sharing this confined space with him. She had spent years building a life that avoided entanglements of this scale. She worked nights. She kept her head down. She paid her bills on time. She stayed clear of the neighborhoods where everyone knew everyone's sins. Yet here she sat, while the man whose name traveled through the city like a whispered warning dissected the fragments of her existence as if they were data points in a complex model. He observed her with the same analytical gaze he seemed to turn on everything. It was not the clinical scrutiny of a physician, nor the predatory stare of a street-level enforcer. It held something more abstract, a strategist's curiosity. Her education, her work patterns, the way she reacted to stress, the stubbornness in the set of her jaw when he mentioned the explosion. He seemed to absorb all of it, quietly recalibrating some internal assessment. The urge to demand that the car stop, to step out into the night and vanish into the anonymous sprawl of the city, pressed against her ribs. The image of her street, of the sudden burst of light, and the knowledge that the blast had been meant for her, pressed back harder. Each mile that the car put between her and the scorched concrete felt like a thin, temporary shield. Stepping out of this moving cage would not return her to safety. It would simply make her a target again, exposed in a world where someone had already proven willing to eliminate her without leaving a trace. The city changed shape outside the windows. The low-rise buildings and aging storefronts of South Arcadia thinned out, replaced by cleaner lines of new construction. Glass and steel rose along the boulevards, reflecting the night in cold, fractured surfaces. Billboards loomed overhead, advertising luxury goods to drivers who passed too quickly to absorb them. Traffic lights burned red and green in perfect rhythm, indifferent to the undercurrent of violence and fear that flowed through the city's underbelly. As the first color of dawn began to gray the horizon, the car left the freeway and slipped into a district that looked like the curated face of Los Angeles. The streets here bore the careful order of corporate planning. Trees had been planted at even intervals, watered on schedule. The pavement showed fewer scars. Security cameras watched silently from building corners, their lenses catching the first pale hints of morning. The car slowed in front of a structure that could have belonged to any respectable company. It was built of glass and concrete, with clean lines and a lobby framed by tall windows. From the street, it suggested nothing more than an office for a firm handling finance, technology, or some other sanitized profession. No signage revealed ownership. The building wore anonymity like a uniform. Inside, anonymity evaporated. Archer's presence reshaped the space the moment they crossed the threshold. The front reception area was understated, staffed by people who looked convincingly like administrative personnel, yet whose eyes tracked movements with the same precision as the driver. Beyond a set of controlled access doors, the architecture shifted. The corridors became narrower, more fortified. Hidden cameras recessed into ceilings watched from subtle angles. The floors absorbed footsteps. Metal detectors and biometric scanners marked the transitions between sections. Marina passed through layers of security, her ID and personal effects taken and logged with quiet efficiency. In this environment, she felt reduced to variables: height, weight, fingerprints, retinal pattern. Every door that closed behind her signaled another step away from the city's surface and deeper into Archer's domain. He led her through a floor that resembled a command center more than an office. Walls carried screens displaying live feeds from multiple locations across Los Angeles. Some showed aerial perspectives, others street-level views. Some bore overlays of data streams, numbers and colored lines shifting in real time. Clusters of people worked at workstations, their focus divided between keyboards and the images unfolding on the walls. Nothing about their posture suggested standard corporate routine. These were operators, analysts, people trained to discern patterns in chaos and translate those patterns into action. She saw maps with highlighted routes, traffic flows, financial transaction graphs uninterpretable to anyone outside the system that had produced them. This was not a business headquarters, it was a nerve center. For the first time, Marina glimpsed the scale of what Archer controlled. He did not merely own clubs or discrete companies. He possessed a web that monitored parts of the city as if they were extensions of his own nervous system. Threats, opportunities, disruptions, they all registered here, processed and fed back into decisions that would never appear in any public record. The realization settled in her bones. This man, who had pulled her off a dying street and into a car, was not simply a powerful figure in some abstract sense. He was a spine running through entire sectors of the city's underground economy. If someone had crossed his interests, the consequences would ripple outward through places most people never knew existed. Standing in that space, surrounded by the quiet hum of servers, the distant murmur of voices, and the constant flow of visual information, Marina understood that she had entered a structure that did not let people walk in and out casually. Archer's protection was not a guest pass. It was a containment field. The moment he had decided she was relevant, she had stepped into a diagram whose edges she could not yet see. Her life, once compressed into the routine of night shifts and small rituals, had been reclassified. She was no longer just a lab technician keeping her head down in a city that preferred it that way. She had become a point of convergence in a conflict between forces she had never agreed to recognize. Reynard Archer operated within that conflict as if it were a familiar climate. He moved through the halls of his building as though he owned not just the property, but the information coursing through every cable embedded in its walls. For him, this was all an extension of a single, cold principle: control the data, control the flow, and the city would bend, sooner or later, to the shape of his will. For Marina, there was only one clear conclusion. Whatever exit existed from this place would not be found quickly, and it would not be granted lightly. Deep inside the complex, past reinforced corridors where sound seemed to dissolve before reaching the walls, Reynard Archer brought Marina to a room designed for one purpose only: analysis without distraction. The lighting was flat and shadowless, the temperature slightly colder than comfortable, the air filtered to an artificial stillness. Nothing in this space suggested warmth or life. It was a place built to dismantle truths and expose fractures. A long glass table occupied the center of the room, and on it lay a digital archive that should not have existed in any legal or ethical sense. It was an unauthorized dossier assembled with the precision of a surveillance operation rather than the curiosity of an investigator. When the first screen flickered awake, Marina felt a tremor of unease travel through her. The archive was about her, every scraped detail of her existence arranged, as if she were a puzzle someone had taken apart to study each piece. Archer did not offer an apology for obtaining it. He stated plainly that he needed to understand how a person with no criminal ties, no significant debts, and no history of escalations had somehow become the central node in a pattern left behind by a dead technician. The dossier was not a violation to him. It was a necessity. Her past unfolded on the screens with clinical detachment. Childhood in Arizona, where the desert had pressed against the edges of quiet neighborhoods. A father who vanished when she was 12, leaving behind a story of debt and irresponsibility that her mother repeated because it was the only explanation she had. A mother who worked double shifts as a nurse until the day an electrical fire consumed their home and left Marina with a duffel bag of salvaged belongings, and a grief she locked away with all the practicality of someone who could not afford to fall apart. Then came the move to California, the university years marked by discipline rather than ambition, and the argument with a professor that seemed trivial at the time. Yet the man resigned only 2 months later under circumstances that were never explained. The dossier traced her choices with an unnerving intimacy. The exact dates of her medical certifications, her relocations, even citations for parking violations she had forgotten. Her digital footprint lay open: old emails, dormant social accounts, the fingerprints of outdated passwords she had abandoned years before. Marina stared at the details with a sensation of displacement, as if she were witnessing another woman's life rendered in code and timestamps. To Archer, these fragments were patterns. To her, they were memories that had never been meant for dissection. As he scrolled through the final pages of the archive, his tone sharpened. The dead technician had accessed a cluster of files that did not belong on the hospital's servers. Those files had been encrypted using a structure that suggested more than simple concealment. It implied the existence of a companion key, something outside the system. The technician's last digital action had been attaching her name to the encrypted set, positioning her as the only valid user capable of unlocking the second half of whatever he had hidden. Archer outlined the implications with his characteristically calm precision. The file was not a simple piece of data. It was a destabilizing force, something that could shift alliances, expose protected networks, or dismantle systems long built on silence. In the hands of the wrong people, it could destroy careers or ignite conflicts between groups that operated beneath the legal surface of the city. It had already drawn blood. Marina tried to reject the notion that any part of this had been meant for her. She insisted she had no knowledge, no connection. Her voice sounded steady, but the tension in her hands betrayed her. Archer did not refute her claim. Instead, he brought up a new set of documents, records no hospital or university database should have contained. Her father's disappearance, long accepted as a man fleeing financial collapse, appeared in a new context. Archer revealed internal memos, testimony fragments, and confidential reports obtained through channels Marina did not want to imagine. Her father had worked as a financial auditor not for an insurance firm, as she had believed, but for a company that had quietly dissolved after federal investigators uncovered links to a criminal network with national reach. Every employee associated with that investigation had vanished, died unexpectedly, or retired under pressure. He suggested the possibility that her father had tried to expose something, or escape something, or dismantle something dangerous. Perhaps he had taken digital evidence with him. Perhaps he had been silenced. The implication cut through her with the cold weight of emerging truth. Her mother had never known the full story. Marina had grown up believing in a narrative shaped by necessity rather than accuracy. Now, those foundational assumptions cracked beneath the pressure of facts Archer laid bare. The technician, the man whose overdose had been staged, whose final hours had been erased, had left her name beside an encrypted file containing pieces of a network her father might once have touched. It was possible the technician had known or discovered something about her family. It was possible he believed Marina possessed the other half of the key, even if she did not know she had it. Archer switched the screens to surveillance feeds circling the perimeter of the complex. Unregistered vehicles had begun to appear on nearby streets. Their engines cooled too quickly for casual passers-by. Their tinted windows reflected nothing. They parked just long enough to suggest observation, then disappeared as new ones took their place. On the rooftops of adjacent buildings, one of Archer's drones captured silhouettes, figures crouched low, tracking sightlines, measuring weak points. His operators interpreted these signs with growing urgency. The lines between factions had been crossed. Someone else believed Marina was not merely connected to the data, but essential to retrieving it. Archer's focus sharpened in a way she had not seen before. The distance he maintained in conversation evaporated. He began issuing quiet directives to his staff, reorganizing their positions, predicting the probable angles of an incursion. The calm in his voice did not diminish. It simply hardened into a colder discipline. Marina felt the atmosphere shift, as though the walls themselves were tensing. She recognized now that her denials did nothing to alter her situation. Ignorance did not protect her. It marked her as unprepared, undefended, and therefore exploitable. Archer understood this instinctively. He had built a life in an ecosystem where knowledge was armor and secrecy was currency. For him, her lack of awareness made her more valuable and more at risk. In the depths of the complex, surrounded by screens that mapped out her past and monitors tracking the danger closing in, Marina stood at the center of a crisis she did not understand. Yet she felt the gravity of it settling around her. A file that was never meant to exist had surfaced. A dead technician had tied it to her name, and the city's quiet wars had shifted in her direction, drawing her into their current with the force of something irreversible. When the perimeter around the main complex came under coordinated assault, a formation moving with the precision of a unit trained for quiet eradication rather than intimidation, Archer made the decision in seconds. The primary facility was compromised. The attackers were not there to scare them, but to extract or eliminate. He moved Marina through reinforced corridors and down to a concealed exit, where an unmarked vehicle waited under camouflage netting. By the time the second wave breached the outer courtyard, they were already on the freeway, heading east toward the dark outline of the San Bernardino foothills. The reserve site sat buried beneath layers of history and neglect, a relic built during years when governments believed bunkers could rewrite the outcome of a conflict. Its shell of gray concrete blended into the terrain, and its rusted outer gates looked too decayed to function, masking the reinforced bulkheads behind them. Once inside, the world shifted sharply away from the neon pulse of Lowe's angels. The silence here felt older, denser, as if time itself moved differently within these walls. Archer treated the station not as a sanctuary, but as a staging ground. He explained that the encrypted file could not be fully recovered from the fragments the technician had left behind. Something physical was missing, an object that acted as a validating second key. No digital reconstruction could compensate for that absent element. Someone involved had once carried it, protected it, perhaps hidden it. And that person, every sign suggested, had been Marina's father. Her memories felt disjointed when she tried to summon them. The fire that had destroyed their home had consumed not only rooms and belongings, but large sections of the past. Yet certain images persisted. A metal box her father kept on a high closet shelf, filled with documents she was never allowed to handle, a worn leather wallet, a compass-shaped keychain he carried everywhere. She had believed it meant nothing, just a relic he liked. Archer listened with a stillness that conveyed both concentration and calculation. He saw meaning where she had seen sentiment. He believed the keychain was not a souvenir but a carrier, built with a micro-embedded module capable of holding encrypted data. They drove to the remains of her childhood house, a burned-out structure long overtaken by dust and neglect. The neighborhood had moved on. New families lived nearby without knowing what had happened decades earlier. The walls of the surviving storage shed still bore the warped stains of heat. In a corner beneath warped shelving, they found the box exactly where she remembered it had been. The metal compass lay inside, tarnished but intact. When Archer tested the casing with a handheld scanner, faint signals pulsed back, weak, old, but undeniably present. Inside the thin shell of the compass, a chip had been embedded. It contained partial coordinates, encrypted sequences, and timestamps connected to a network she did not recognize. All of it pointed to a location in the high desert, an old distribution station built before the widespread transition to fiber networks. Official records showed it had been decommissioned years ago. Utility maps marked it as dormant infrastructure awaiting demolition. But the coordinates in the compass contradicted those claims. They aligned with an autonomous data storage system still active beneath the surface. Archer theorized that her father had transferred a secondary copy of financial documents there, records exposing a flow of illicit funds that would challenge established lines of power. The technician who died had likely attempted to retrace the same steps, using fragments of the old data chain. If he had reached the station, he might have triggered alarms or been intercepted. And if Marina's name had been linked to the technician's encrypted message, she had become the next potential path. The drive toward the desert grew harsher the deeper they went. Low fog drifted above the sand and brush, thick enough to distort shapes into ghostly silhouettes. Old industrial structures rose intermittently along the road, abandoned during downturns and left to corrode under endless sun. The sky overhead stretched wide and pale, carrying the scent of dust and overheated metal. Archer drove with the focus of someone for whom the route was not unfamiliar. His hands were steady on the wheel, his posture relaxed but alert, as though he could navigate trouble by intuition alone. Marina watched the landscape change in slow gradients, first dry hills, then flat expanses of cracked earth. The world here felt stripped of everything unnecessary, including noise. As they neared the coordinates, she felt a tightening in her chest, less from fear than from the sense that her father's shadow still existed somewhere in the emptiness. The station appeared suddenly behind a cluster of weather-beaten structures, a low concrete bunker, its front half collapsed, but its inner levels still shielded by steel reinforcements. Two vehicles sat beside it. Their plates had been removed, their windows darkened, their engines still warm. Archer braked their car at a distance, observing the angle of the parked vehicles, the disturbed dust patterns around the tires, and the footprints leading toward the entrance. He concluded with quiet certainty that they were not alone. Whatever had drawn them here, documents, evidence, some hidden truth, had drawn others first. For those others, the station was not a waypoint but a target. Inside, they would not expect negotiation or surrender. They would be there to gather, destroy, or silence. Archer moved with practiced precision. He outlined fallback routes, pointed out weak spots in the terrain, and determined which exits might still be accessible. He checked the wind, the light, the places where shadows pooled too heavily. When he approached the entrance, he did so with the silence of someone who had entered hostile structures before and expected to again. The metal doors groaned faintly when he eased them open, their hinges resisting after years of disuse. A draft of cold, stale air reached them, carrying the smell of dust and oxidized machinery. The corridor ahead descended gradually, its walls stained by water that had seeped through concrete. The silence felt dense enough to press against the skin. Deeper inside, as they followed the narrowing hallways, Marina sensed the shift in temperature and in atmosphere. The bunker seemed to absorb sound. Her footsteps felt too loud, her breath too sharp. Even Archer's presence, grounded and controlled, could not thin the tension. The server level sat beneath layers of flooring that vibrated faintly with remote energy, the heartbeat of outdated but still functioning equipment. Rows of metal racks lined the room, many dead, a few humming weakly. Dust floated where their flashlights cut through the air. Somewhere among these structures lay the fragment her father had hidden. Somewhere in this darkness lay answers she had never sought yet now could not avoid. She knew then that everything behind her had already changed. Ahead lay something irreversible, whether revelation or threat. The bunker felt like a threshold, a place where the past had embedded itself so deeply into concrete that it could not be ignored any longer. There was no returning to the person she had been before crossing through the station's outer gates. Only movement forward remained, into the cold, into the hum of forgotten machines, into the truth that waited in the shadows. The descent into the server level had already felt like a transition from one reality to another, but the moment they crossed the threshold into the main chamber, the atmosphere shifted into something denser, more saturated. The air was stale, as if it had been breathing the same dust for decades, and yet it carried a sharp undercurrent of metal and something faintly singed. It pressed against the lungs in a way that made every inhale feel deliberate. Marina felt the tension rise along her skin before her mind caught up. The walls were bare concrete, stained with old leaks, the color of tired bone. The ceiling hung low enough that the overhead fixtures seemed too close, their cold, flickering light cutting narrow trenches through the gloom. Rows of server racks stretched in parallel lines, like the ribs of some mechanical carcass. Some units were silent and dead, their indicators dark. Others still hummed faintly, a vibration barely audible, but perceptible in the soles of her boots. It struck her, not for the first time, that spaces like this were built to outlast people. Systems could be replaced, drives swapped, cables rerouted. Human beings left dents in the dust and stains on the floor, and then the machines continued without them. Archer moved ahead of her, an outline of composed intent against the pale light. Up close, he no longer resembled a distant, untouchable figure tied to rumors and whispered stories. Down here, stripped of the glass and chrome of his command center, he seemed more like an instrument designed for these kinds of places. He did not waste glances. Each turn of his head served a purpose. His eyes tracked corners, junction points, high shelves where a rifle could rest. His breathing stayed steady, measured, as if his body automatically adjusted itself to the demands of confined, hostile environments. Marina had seen men in emergency situations before, patients, and relatives in the hospital who clung to composure by sheer force of will. Archer's calm was different. It did not arise from denial or shock. It came from repetition, from a long familiarity with danger that had carved out reflexes and routines. He belonged in this controlled chaos in a way that both unsettled and reassured her. Her own steps felt louder than they were. Each contact of her boot with the concrete sounded like an intrusion. The lab where she worked at night had a similar mechanical hum, but there the sound carried an implicit promise of structure and safety. Here, every vibration seemed loaded with threat. She noticed her hands, how they had automatically curled into fists, nails pressing faint crescents into her palms. As they advanced between the server racks, she saw the first body. The man lay near the far wall, legs twisted at an unnatural angle, arms stretched toward a dropped weapon. The black fabric of his uniform absorbed the light, but the exposed skin where his mask had torn showed a waxy pallor. The blood around him had dried in uneven patterns, darker near the wound, faded at the edges. Two more bodies lay close by, their positions telling a story of rapid, efficient violence. Their masks remained intact, their eyes invisible behind tinted visors. Marina had learned to read scenes of injury, but this tableau differed from what she saw in the hospital. There were no improvised attempts at first aid, no chaotic traces of panic. The dead here had fallen in clean arcs, the way pieces dropped off a board. Someone had executed a plan with ruthless precision. Archer crouched briefly beside one of the bodies, his expression tightening in a way only someone watching him closely would notice. His gaze focused on a small emblem stitched into the sleeve, an insignia subtle enough that most people would have missed it, but not him. In that moment, he was no longer just reacting to a threat, he was categorizing it. He recognized the unit, and with that recognition came a recalibration of risk. The group was known among certain circles, rarely named outside of encrypted channels and whispered assessments. Composed of former special forces and private contractors, they did not belong to any state, only to contracts. They specialized in clean extractions, silent removals, and operations that left no narrative behind, only absence. Whoever had hired them to come here possessed resources and a willingness to burn lives like currency. Marina tried to imagine her father somewhere in this chain of decisions, a man with a quiet job and a strained smile, caught between spreadsheets and unspoken threats. The image did not fit with the brutality in front of her, and yet the connection had already been laid by the data they had found. Her mind kept returning to small details. The way he had always checked locks twice, the tiredness in his shoulders after long days, the way he used to pause mid-sentence sometimes, as if listening to something only he could hear. They moved deeper into the chamber, drawn toward the coordinates embedded in the compass, and confirmed by the chip. Archer's focus narrowed on a specific section of the racks. One unit differed slightly from the others, disguised as an antiquated server, but built with reinforced casing and redundant connections. The interface panel showed no obvious signs of forced entry. The mercenaries had reached it, examined it, and then either retreated or been interrupted before they could break it open. Archer accessed the housing with deliberate, practiced movements. Underneath the external facade lay a compact module, insulated against heat and electromagnetic interference, the kind of hardware used for records that had to survive even if everything around them collapsed. When it powered on, the connection to the partial archive already recovered in his systems became clear. Financial flows glimmered across the screen in condensed form, lines of transactions connecting shell companies, charitable funds, development projects, political campaigns, and private accounts. Marina could not parse the graphs, but she recognized the pattern beneath the numbers. This was not simple theft. It was an entire circulatory system, money moving like blood through veins that never saw daylight. Her father had audited pieces of this pattern. The dead technician had tried to resurface it. Now she stood in front of the concentrated nucleus of a crime that did not look like one at first glance, because it had been designed to mimic stability and prosperity on the surface. Her understanding of her father tilted again. For years, she had carried a quiet resentment toward his absence, layered over with grief. The official explanation had reduced him to a man who had run from debt and responsibility. Now, staring at the module, she saw another possibility. He might have tried to expose what he found. He might have refused to keep washing numbers clean when he realized what they hid. In a world where this system existed, where it touched the lives of powerful people who never appeared in police reports, such refusal would not have been tolerated. The station around them seemed to lean in, as if the concrete wanted to hear whether she would accept this new version of her own history. It was at that point that the illusion of being alone shattered. A voice cut through the heavy air behind them, sharp and commanding, ordering them to drop to the floor. It carried not just authority but impatience, the tone of someone who felt time slipping and control threatened. Archer's shoulders stiffened in a way that barely registered visually, but Marina sensed the shift through proximity alone. He did not turn immediately. He assessed. In the metallic reflection of a nearby panel, she caught glimpses of movement, dark shapes fanning out at the entrance to the chamber. The remaining members of the unit had waited in the upper corridors, listening, tracking their progress. They had let Archer and Marina descend into the deepest, least escapable part of the station before revealing themselves. Now they held the tactical advantage, high ground at the door, clear lines of fire, numbers. Their attention was not centered on the server module. It fixed on her. They knew her name. That small fact made her stomach constrict. The network behind them had not only traced the data, it had mapped inheritance. To them, she was not just a random technician drawn into events accidentally. She was the daughter of the auditor who had tried to destabilize the system. That genetic tie made her dangerous in ways code alone could not. In the hospital, she had often been the unseen figure working behind glass or in side rooms, processing test results, labeling samples. Here, in this buried chamber, she had become the focal point of armed men who had been paid to remove obstacles. Archer calculated the geometry of the room in an instant. The narrow aisles between racks, the limited cover, the distance between them and the door, all of it shaped his options. He had been trained, formally or not, for exactly these scenarios. His body knew what to do even before his conscious mind finished considering it. For him, survival had always been less about heroics and more about probabilities, angles, and speed. He understood that negotiation would not overturn the orders given to these men. They were not there to bargain. The existence of the container in his hands and the identity of the woman beside him had already crossed lines that could not be uncrossed. The only outcomes available were escape or death. He moved. To Marina, the next seconds fractured into staccato frames rather than a continuous flow. One moment Archer stood with the module in his hand, his profile lit by the dull glow of the servers. The next, he had pivoted toward the attackers with a burst of motion that cut across the stale air like a thrown blade. He did not shout warnings or commands. He simply acted. The first man at the door went down before his weapon could stabilize. Archer had closed the distance between them in a rush that used the aisle for cover and the element of surprise as his sharpest tool. Elbows, knees, the edge of his forearm. His body became a sequence of impacts directed at joints and throats. In the confined space, gunfire was risky for everyone, including the mercenaries. They hesitated for a fraction of a heartbeat, and that hesitation widened the opening he needed. Marina pressed her back against a rack, feeling the faint vibration of servers through the metal. She knew that if she tried to run, she would expose herself to every line of sight in the room. Remaining still was counterintuitive, but she understood instinctively that her movement would distort the pattern Archer was shaping. So she froze, muscles locked, breath held just enough to avoid hyperventilating. The chamber descended into a muted violence. There were no drawn-out cries, only the dull smacks of impact, the short exhale of air forced from lungs, the scrape of boots on concrete. An occasional shot cracked the heavy silence, deafeningly loud in the enclosed space, followed by the metallic clang of a bullet hitting metal rather than flesh. A server tower toppled, its plastic casing shattering, sparks spitting briefly before dying. Archer fought in a way that showed this was not a skill he had acquired for sport. Every strike he delivered was aimed to disable rather than intimidate. He exploited the close quarters, turning the attacker's numbers into a liability. More bodies meant less space to maneuver, more chances to get in each other's way. He used racks as shields, bodies as barriers, equipment as improvised obstacles. Marina watched him move with a detached clarity she would only later recognize as shock. She saw how his weight shifted, always balanced, how his face remained stripped of visible emotion even as he delivered blows that would leave lasting damage or end a life entirely. In that moment, she glimpsed the part of him that the city feared, the part that justified all those stories about a man who held invisible levers. Underneath his tailored suits and strategic calculations, there existed this core. Someone who survived by being more precise, more relentless, and more willing to do what others could not. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the fight ended. The room settled into a heavy, throbbing quiet. The hum of surviving servers resumed its place as the dominant sound. The scattered clatter of debris stopped. Archer remained standing in the aisle, shoulders rising and falling with the effort of controlled breathing. A shallow cut marked his cheek, another his forearm. Dark stains spread slowly on his sleeve. Around him, the attackers lay in collapsed heaps, their bodies arranged by impact rather than intention. Their weapons had scattered across the floor, some still within reach of lifeless fingers. The concrete, previously only stained by old leaks and dust, now bore new marks. Blood pooled under some of the fallen men, seeping into cracks, spreading in quiet, irregular shapes. It glistened under the harsh light, a reminder that even in a world of encrypted data and financial schemes, the final cost still arrived in physical form. Archer returned to the container as if completing an interrupted gesture. He lifted it from where it had slid during the struggle and checked its casing with a quick, practiced inspection. Only then did he look directly at Marina. For the first time, his gaze held something beyond evaluation. There was still calculation there, still the constant assessment of risk and options, but layered over it was a more human concern. He needed to confirm that she remained intact, not just as a witness or as a necessary piece in a larger operation, but as an individual whose survival had become non-negotiable in his mind. He had acted throughout the fight, as if the space she occupied behind that server rack was the fixed point that could not be compromised. Marina realized that her knees were trembling. She forced them to steady, unwilling to give the room or the ghosts on the floor the satisfaction of watching her collapse. Her body hummed with residual adrenaline, her senses sharpened to an almost painful degree. She noticed small, insignificant details. The way one of the attacker's gloves had torn at the seam, the faint smear of dirt on Archer's collar, the flicker of a malfunctioning monitor in the corner. The module in Archer's hand had become more than a piece of hardware. It represented a fracture line running through the city's hidden structure. Behind the financial flows and encoded records lay decisions that had shaped lives without their consent. Her father had tried to interfere with that pattern. The technician had tried to resurrect his attempt. She herself, unknowingly, had been pulled along the same current. Now, with the bodies at her feet and the data in Archer's grasp, there was no plausible story that would allow her to step back into anonymity. Archer understood this with a clarity born from years of reading people and situations. He knew that the organization behind these mercenaries would not interpret failure as a reason to reconsider. It would interpret it as a reason to escalate. The presence of this many operatives in a single operation meant the stakes were already high. The loss of all of them, combined with the survival of their targets, would demand retaliation. He mentally traced the chain. The contractor who had hired this group, the intermediary who had passed on the time frame and coordinates, the individuals whose names would appear in the data if it were ever decrypted and shared. All of them, in one way or another, now had reasons to fear both him and the woman standing beside him. He did not ask her whether she understood the implications. He could see it in the set of her mouth, in the way she held her shoulders, in the slight narrowing of her eyes. She was a scientist by training, someone used to extrapolating outcomes from available data. Even without his level of experience, she could follow the trajectory of this situation. Ignorance, which might have once served as her shield, had evaporated. Knowledge was a burden now, but also the only weapon available. In a corner of her mind, she registered the shift in her perception of Archer himself. Until this point, he had been an entity defined by control and distance, a force operating at some abstract level above ordinary lives. Watching him fight, bleed, and then turn immediately back to the task at hand grounded him in a different way. He was not invulnerable. He had simply made a habit of walking into places most people avoided and doing what they could not bring themselves to do. A faint vibration traveled through the floor, almost imperceptible at first. Marina might have missed it if she had not been standing so still. The station breathed again, but this time the rhythm came from above. Footsteps echoed down the concrete stairwell in a new pattern. They were measured, neither hurried nor hesitant, suggesting a second wave with a different assignment or another faction drawn by the same coordinates and the same lure of contained power. Archer heard it too. His posture shifted just enough to reveal that some reserves of energy still remained. The fight they had just survived was not the end, only the opening move in a broader conflict spilling into physical space. He closed the remaining distance between himself and Marina, one hand tightening around the container, the other reaching toward her in a grip that meant urgency, not reassurance. The message was implicit and absolute. They could not stay. The station had given up its secret. Now it would claim whoever lingered inside it as payment. The escape from the abandoned station unfolded like a sequence of narrowing corridors, each one darker and more suffocating than the last. They moved quickly but not recklessly, climbing through maintenance shafts and ascending emergency stairwells coated in dust and age. Every echo in the passageways felt amplified, as if the bunker itself listened to their flight with a patience older than either of them. Marina stayed close behind Archer, watching the way his shoulders shifted with each turn, each adjustment, each calculation made in silence. Her pulse had settled into a steady, low thrum that resonated through her limbs. It no longer felt like fear. It was something more elemental, an internal compass aligning itself to a new direction. The remnants of her old life, routine shifts at the hospital, quiet evenings alone, an identity built around not being noticed, fell away with every step upward. She had crossed a threshold, and the world behind her no longer fit. When they reached the upper exit, a sharp gust of night air swept through the broken frame of the doorway. The desert stretched ahead in a vast, indifferent darkness. The sky hung low and starless, suffocated by a layer of drifting dust. The ground sloped down in uneven ridges, and in the creases between them small clusters of headlights flickered to life. The vehicles had been waiting, engines low, silhouettes half swallowed by the terrain. Archer paused just long enough to register each position. His breathing stayed steady, but Marina sensed the shift in him, a tightening of focus, a recalibration of probabilities. He did not need to speak for her to understand that these were the forces sent to seal the corridor they had just escaped. They broke into a run. The incline tore at Marina's legs, but momentum carried her forward. Archer kept a pace calibrated to her stride, neither slowing too much nor pulling ahead. When the first vehicle lurched into motion, its headlights slicing across the ground in harsh beams, Archer shifted course, guiding her toward a concealed rise of rock. The off-road vehicle they had left earlier waited behind it, shielded by the uneven slope as if placed there by foresight rather than luck. The engine roared to life before Marina had even closed her door. Dust exploded behind them, rising in a cloud that swallowed the tail of their path. The chase that followed was less a pursuit than a contest between will and terrain. The ground pitched violently beneath the tires, the suspension screamed in protest, jagged stones snapped under the strain. The desert night became a blur of movement and fleeting shadows. For a moment, Marina felt as though the world narrowed to the interior of the car. The vibration of the engine beneath her feet, Archer's hands steady on the wheel, the rhythmic rise and fall of her own breath. Far behind them, the lights of the pursuing vehicles grew smaller. The terrain was on their side now, and Archer drove with an instinct that seemed to anticipate each shift in the ground. He took paths that were barely visible, cutting through dry channels and around old mining scars. The silence inside the vehicle contrasted sharply with the violence of their movement, the two forces creating a fragile balance. By the time they crossed into the outskirts of San Bernardino, another car pulled alongside them, a dark sedan, its windows tinted, moving with the precision of a trained escort. Archer slowed just enough to let the vehicles align. A brief exchange of signals followed, so minimal Marina would have missed it if she had blinked. The sedan took the lead, guiding them through a network of side streets until they reached a secure garage shielded from view by industrial warehouses. Only when the doors sealed behind them did Archer's posture loosen, fractionally. Marina held the container against her chest, the weight of it grounding her. It was more than a piece of evidence now. It held the last echoes of her father's fight, the reason she had been pulled into this shadowed world, the key capable of reshaping the power running beneath the city's surface. Archer watched her in the muted light of the garage. His expression carried the same deliberate neutrality as always, but something beneath it had altered, subtle, quiet, and irreversible. He had taken risks tonight that went beyond professional obligation. He had chosen her survival at moments when the odds favored retreat. The awareness of that choice hummed between them, unspoken but undeniable. He finally explained the next step with a clarity that left no room for illusion. There existed a group of federal agents embedded so deeply in undercover operations that their names never appeared in official rosters. They had spent years collecting fragments of information, waiting for something substantial enough to dismantle the network that had shaped so much of the city's economy from beneath the surface. The data in Marina's hands could give them the leverage they needed. In return, Archer would gain something he had never openly sought, an exit. Not freedom from consequences, but an opportunity to shift the trajectory of his own life before it calcified into something irreversible. The world he had built, fortified by money, influence, and the ability to manipulate invisible currents, was beginning to fracture. Technologies evolved, alliances shifted, new players emerged. Staying in place meant eventual collapse. Moving now meant survival on his own terms. Marina listened, feeling the weight of her decision settle into her chest. She had a choice. She could walk away. She could change her name, erase her digital footprint, return to a quieter existence somewhere far from Lowe's angels. There were ways to disappear. Archer could have them arranged within hours. She could return to studying blood samples, processing data, living a life of silence and observation. But she knew that choice was an illusion. The network would not stop searching for the missing link in their broken chain. Her father's legacy had bound her to this conflict long before she understood it. Running would buy time, not freedom. And she would carry the knowledge in her chest like a smoldering ember, one that would eventually consume whatever fragile piece she tried to build. Archer was the only person who had not treated her as a tool, even when her involvement served his needs. He had stepped into danger to protect her not because she was useful, but because he had chosen to. And she recognized in that choice a rare kind of alignment, two lives intersecting not by chance, but by necessity. Her conclusion came not as a surge of emotion, but as a quiet, steady certainty. She told him she would stay, not for vengeance, not for duty, but because facing the truth meant finishing what had begun years ago. Because the city needed the kind of fracture this evidence would create. And because the path forward, dangerous, uncertain, and shadowed, felt more authentic than anything waiting behind her. Archer accepted her decision in silence, but the shift in his stance revealed more than words could. A line had been crossed, one that redirected both of their trajectories. For him, her choice created a new dimension of responsibility. For her, it rewrote the shape of her own identity. They traveled to one of his secured bunkers as dawn approached. The structure overlooked the sprawl of the city from high ground, hidden beneath reinforced shielding. The machinery inside was already active, screens glowing with encrypted channels, relay systems humming quietly, data links establishing secure connections to the agents operating undercover. Marina stood near the observation window as the first light broke across the mountains. The city below flickered awake, unaware of the shift poised to shake its foundations. For the first time in years, she did not feel hollow. A sense of grounded purpose settled into her, cooling and solid. She had not simply survived the night. She had stepped into her own story, one forged from shadows, sharpened by truth, and shaped by choices that could not be undone. Archer stood beside her, his silhouette outlined against the pale light. He had crossed a threshold as well, leaving behind a form of power that had anchored his life for years. Ahead lay a world defined by risk and consequence rather than control. The new line of fate stretched before them, uncertain, dangerous, but undeniably theirs. Story written and directed for Dark Hearts Collection. Thank you for being part of this silence between storms. More stories soon.